Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Keneilwe Munyai, and I am coming to you from Cape Town, very hot Cape Town at the moment. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you and sharing my own experiences of delivering design thinking training across the African continent. I am going to share my screen. I just have a couple of slides. Oops. Okay, I'm just waiting for you to allow me to share my screen.
Okay, you should be able to.
Okay, I think I've got it now.
Cool, perfect.
Okay, can you guys see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in South Africa. I was born and bred in South Africa. And I am from the northern part of, so this is the map of South Africa for those of you who've never been. I'm from the northern part, but I now live in Cape Town, which is right at the tip. And the darkened areas on the map are the areas that I've actually lived in as a child. And of course, my reality or the context that I grew up in looks a little bit like this, very rural, very rich in terms of local knowledge and practices. And of course, if you're looking at it from an outsider's perspective, it could be said that it is a very resource scarce part of the country. But in my view, it is quite rich. And you'll see why as I talk later on. And what makes it rich for me, reflecting on my own experience, is the freedom that I had as a child, the ability to just go outside and play with friends, the ability to use found objects to create playthings. I think that makes the experience even richer and far more exciting. And of course, there are changes. The communities are evolving and they're developing. And now, if you look at the image on the right-hand side, that's what some of the rural communities have started looking like. But I still have good memories of growing up and being all dusty and gray from playing outside and playing with the soil. So in terms of my journey to where I am now, so I left home, came to Cape Town to study design, and ended up spending a year in Italy looking at, because I started developing an interest in issues of sustainability and local knowledge and bringing the two together. And also, I think in a way, I was also quite curious to understand. We talk a lot about sustainability, but what does it actually mean in practice and in reality? And if we are saying now we should be focusing on sustainability, what did we do before industrialization? What were the local communities? How were they producing things? For example, in my case, my focus was on leather industry and trying to understand how did local communities produce leather? And as a result, I spent a year, like I said, in Italy to understand local communities, especially family-owned businesses. And upon returning to South Africa, I started teaching design at the University of Johannesburg, fashion design and manufacturing processes in fashion production. And as I was doing that, I started developing a lot more questions. And you'll realize as I talk that a lot of what I'm doing is driven by curiosity. I do something and then I start, having questions and I start questioning what I'm doing. So while I was teaching at the University of Johannesburg, I realized that my reality of having studied in Cape Town, which is a completely different context to Johannesburg. In Cape Town, I was part of the minority in terms of design students, whereas in Johannesburg, the students that I was teaching were mainly African students. But in terms of the teaching approach, it was exactly the same as the way I was taught in Cape Town, where the focus is on, you know, international practices and references to international designers, which I know nothing about. And so I started asking myself, are we actually preparing the students that we are teaching to be able to go back into the communities they come from so that they are able to make a meaningful impact? And as a result of that question, I started designing projects that will force students to move away from these curated spaces in which we teach design to going back to the communities to gain a better understanding of the reality and the problems that they should be focusing their design skills and knowledge to solve. And of course, that was not an easy thing. It was an experiment driven by curiosity, and because it was outside of the, you know, traditional structured curriculum, it had to be sort of a minor element of the overall program. But I was grateful that I had an opportunity to sort of engage students and get them to rethink and also to reflect on why are we doing what we are doing? Why are we teaching design the way we are teaching it? What do we want to achieve with that teaching that we are doing? And so after 2 years of working at the University of Johannesburg, I got an opportunity to join the Hasselplattner School of Design Thinking, and I'm sure most of you know about the D schools across the globe. And so I took that opportunity because I thought it was going to enable me to contribute towards, you know, changing the way we teach design and the way we apply design and where we actually design. And so for the past 5 years, I was part of the D-School team. We developed some materials for training and capacitation, working, you know, in the public sector, private sector, in academia, and so forth. But I've also worked in various parts of the continent as well, in countries like Algeria, Morocco, and so forth, applying human-centered design. So that's a little bit about I know that it's long, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of context of who I am. And then in terms of design thinking training, so the way I do it, or the human-centered human-centered design work that I'm doing, focuses a lot on changing mindsets. So it's about empowering individuals and organizations. And the starting point is, of course, with tools and methods, but ultimately the goal is to help make this a way of being, not just something that you apply when you're doing a project, but you become more human-centered in everything that you do, whether it's working on a project or trying to solve a certain problem. And of course, starting point is with the tools and methods, like I said, and then of course, the practice, the application, so the doing part, and then moving on to the thinking, and all of these, they influence each other. And even though I'm saying the starting point is with tools and methods, it doesn't necessarily, it's all about practice. It's all about doing and reflecting as well. And that's how over time, then it becomes a mindset, or it becomes a way of being. And then in terms of some of the projects that I've been involved in, like I said earlier on, I've worked with government to support innovative solutions to the city's challenges in Cape Town. And one example is the water situation. I think about 2 years ago, we had a very serious drought. And of course, everybody was panicking because we thought Cape Town was going to run out of water. And so I worked a lot with government officials and citizens to sort of come up with strategies of how we could all contribute towards saving, not only saving water, but the way we view water. And what was interesting with this project is that it gave us a lot of insights in terms of understanding the relationship that we have with water as individuals. So for example, you have individuals who think that I can save water when I'm at home because I'm responsible, I have to pay for it. But at work, I don't have to because somebody else is paying for it. But in reality, it comes from the same source. So whether you're at home or you are at work, the water comes from the same source and your behavior has to be consistent. You have to understand that it's not limitless. And of course, just to highlight another interesting project is around the issue of transformation. So in South Africa, there's a lot of conversations around transformation, especially in academic institutions. Transformation in terms of staff that teaches, but also transformation in terms of curriculum, what we teach and how we teach it. And so I've been working with some faculties at the University of Cape Town just to gain because as soon as the word transformation is thrown about, there's the response is quite interesting. There are some people who are, embracing it and excited about it, but there are also people who are resistant to it because it triggers fear. They, from their perspective, transformation means that, they'll lose their jobs and so forth. And so using human-centered design to sort of develop a shared understanding. What do we actually mean by transformation? And what are the different aspects of transformation that we need to pursue? Just the last example to share with you is another project that I've been working on. It's still ongoing around creating an enabling environment for mothers returning to work so that they can be able to continue breastfeeding. So we did some research right at the beginning to understand mothers' experiences, because if you're looking at it from a policy perspective, there is a written policy that everybody seemed to think that it's, a great policy. But in reality, that policy is great is great from a written document perspective. In practice, it's a completely different scenario. And so it's been interesting. It's been a very interesting learning journey for me to learn from mothers themselves who are returning to work after giving birth, but also learning from managers themselves who are supposed to be contributing towards the implementation of these policies. So in terms of the process, I'm sure everybody in this call is aware that there is quite a large variety of processes that people are using in design thinking. So in my time at the DIS school, we were using the Potsdam DIS school process, which is if you move from understanding, problem understanding, observing, POV, ideation, prototyping, and testing. And of course, it's an iterative process. And And I've been reflecting a lot on the process itself. The way it's framed, the words that I use, or the terms that I used to describe the process. Okay, I understand, it makes sense. But when we talk about observe, I think what I've come to realize based on my own experience on the continent is that observe is limiting because you're not just observing once you get to that mode. And the other thing is often these are referred to as phases of design thinking, which I feel doesn't actually capture what this is all about. It's more around modes of working and thinking. That is my view, because I feel if you're saying it's a phase is something you do, you move on to the next. Whereas if it's modes of working and thinking, it's continuously divergent and convergent, and it's iterative. Sorry, I'm sharing a lot of my own reflections here based on what I've been doing for the past couple of years. So when I look at like I said earlier on, when I look at the process, the human-centered design process, for me, it's not only, I know that there's the UK framework that everybody refers to quite a bit, which is diverging and converging. And I feel that you're continuously diverging and converging throughout the modes of working and thinking. Because if you're trying to understand the problem, you're likely to start by, every team member sharing their own experiences and sharing their own lived experiences. You're putting out a lot of information. And then by the time you move on to the engaging mode, you've diverged and converged quite a bit. At least that has been my experience. And of course, another thing that I started questioning and I mentioned earlier on, the observe. It's not, for me, it's more than observing. It's more around engaging a wide variety of stakeholders to gain their perspectives on the problem. And the observing, or calling that mode of working and thinking observing, I often had participants thinking that they are just going out to watch other people engage in their activities. And so that is why hence the reframing to engage. Because if you're saying you are going to go out and engage with various stakeholders, I think it makes it clear to the participants as to what is expected of them. And I think the rest of the process you guys are aware of. The other thing that I would like to talk about a little bit is the notion of designing with as opposed to designing for. And not to say that there's anything wrong with designing for, because obviously in human-centered design, even if you are designing for, you are likely to go out and engage with the people that are impacted by the problem. But what I've come to realize is that on the continent, it is, especially because of the environments in which we do design, sometimes we forget the reality in which the solutions have to exist in. And so the notion of designing with becomes critical. And I love this African proverb because I think it captures exactly what this is all about. It is the one who lives in the house who knows where the roof leaks. If you are trying to solve a problem for somebody who lives in an informal settlement, why would you not involve them in the process? Because they are the ones who understand the context better. And so this is quite important, because if you are going to be designing in a wonderful curated studio, you get caught up, you get into that mode, and you get caught up in that current reality. And that's why I feel that in order for us to be able to solve the right problems, especially on the continent, it is important that we either do the designing in situ so that we can always have that reminder of what is the reality that we are designing for. And of course, I have this example as well, where I worked with a group of kids. So we had one of the big organizations funding a science center. So they gave money to one of the academic institutions and other organizations to build a science center. And the idea was that this science center is going to be in a community, in an informal settlement. And so through engaging in conversations with the different stakeholders that were part of the project, I just asked, what is the community's perspective on the science center, and who's going to be using the science center? And the response was that, oh, it's going to be the schools, the surrounding schools, and well, the community, there was no thinking about the community in which this center is going to exist in. And so I proposed that we run a couple of workshops to gain a better understanding of the community, but also gain perspectives from the kids themselves that are going to be using the science center. The first response that I got was, the kids don't know much about science. That's why we want to build the science center in the community. And so I took this as a challenge. Why don't we actually run these sessions and find out from the kids whether they know about science or not? And what was interesting is that during the sessions, so obviously I brought in the design process and the design tools to enable the kids to communicate their own thinking of what a science center in their own community might look like, and what would be important and what would make it work. And some of the interesting insights were that the kids started off by looking at their own parents, involving their own parents in the science center, because their feeling was that if their own parents don't know where they are, they're not going to send them to a science center for security reasons. But if the community is involved, then the science center will be a safe space. And this is I think this kind of, there's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of assumptions that we make about communities and other stakeholders. And I think what human-centered design, especially a contextualized human-centered design, allows us to do is it enables us to realize that the voices of the people impacted by the problem should be more prominent, and they are the ones that matters the most. That's just another example that I am going to skip. In terms of the design thinking principles, so I have a couple of examples just to show you how, because in my introduction, I spoke about the fact that I started developing an interest when I completed my undergraduate studies in the concept of sustainability, and particularly in design. And I thought that it would be important to also bring my own reflections and learnings here, especially in the work that I'm doing at the moment. So we all know that there are all these wonderful principles. You've seen the images that I've shown before in terms of the reality of the context where I work, or where I'm trying to come up with solutions for, or co-create solutions for. There are some design thinking principles that we use on a daily basis, But I often wondered, what do they actually mean in reality? And also after having spent time in various parts of the continents as well, I often question whether do people actually get what it means, what the concept actually mean. And so as a result of that, I started looking at what would be the most interesting or most relevant ways to communicate some of these design concepts so that they make sense to anyone, anywhere. And of course, it doesn't mean that there's one language or one that these would work in other contexts, but this is for my reality. This is for my context. For example, the concept of collaboration. In practice, it's there. A lot of communities collaborate on a daily basis. People work in community gardens. People, if they have a wedding, they come together and collaborate. But I think that the best way to capture it is with an African proverb. If you want to go quickly, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. And I think that's the essence of collaboration. And I've already mentioned this part. The other thing that that came to mind as I was thinking about my own or reflecting on my own experiences is this notion of the emphasis on space, innovation spaces. Those who consider themselves as leaders in design thinking and human-centered design, they often place a lot of emphasis on building collaborative spaces. And I've realized that actually it's not so much about space than it is about place. Because I think place is more, space is about power, whereas place is about context. And it's important, and I think context is important, especially on on our continent, where there's so much diversity in terms of availability of resources and so forth. And so if you're going to be placing emphasis on creating, a space, I think a lot of energy for me, I'd rather place a lot of energy and emphasis on creating on the content and how the content is responsive to the context in which it's applied. And of course, again, on this, there's this concept of innovation. Everybody is talking about, cultivating an innovation mindset. And I think the best proverb to capture the concept of innovation for me is you cannot discover new oceans unless you have the courage to lose sight of the shore. So the willingness to venture into the unknown, basically, that's what this is all about. That's what innovation should be about. And of course, language matters. And I've highlighted this earlier on, the terms that we use in terms of the process as well is quite important. And especially in like I said, on the continent, there are practices, there are concepts that we in the West are using to capture what we are trying to say. But if you dig deeper in a lot of communities, you'll find that people are actually practicing, they're doing stuff, but they don't give it a name. And so bringing in elements of local knowledge, especially from a design education and a design perspective, I think it helps people realize that we're not embracing something that is completely new to us, but we are actually, you know, we are already doing some of these things. We're already practicing some of these elements. So let's bringing in the terms and how they are brought is quite important, or it matters. And of course, another example that I thought I should share with you is the notion of embracing diversity, which is one of the core principles in human-centered design. And there is a proverb for that too: a common snake which a man sees alone may become a python in his eyes, meaning that it's never enough to judge anything on one man's version. So I think that captures the essence of embracing diverse perspectives. And of course, when you're talking about embracing diversity, it's not just about different cultures and languages and so forth. They are all the other cognitive styles as well. And my last example on the concepts or language and design is the concept of bias towards action. Africans say roaring lion kills no game. So it takes action to do something. So if you want to come up with a solution, you have to take action. But I think the one that I love the most is talking about pumpkins does not make them grow. Meaning that if you want to achieve something, you have to make it happen. You have to take action. So those are some of my examples from some of the work that I've been doing. I think it will be best to actually have a conversation than just having me talking alone about these things.
Yeah, no, that'd be absolutely fantastic, Keneilwe, and thank you so much for that. That's really brilliant, and a virtual round of applause there for Keneilwe. So yeah, that was really, really, really interesting. And at the danger of encouraging pumpkins not to grow, yes, it would be good to have a talk about some of the issues that you've raised. I mean, there's so many issues that have that you raised in there. We've got about 20 minutes left, so first of all, I'm just going to open it out to everybody, and maybe if we focus the first few questions, if people have questions on what Keneilwe has just talked about. So anything that anybody wanted to clarify or ask a bit more, ask for a bit more detail. So does anybody want to stick their hand up or go for it? No? Sancha, do you want to?
Yeah, I thought that was wonderful. I thought that was really, really wonderful talk, really interesting, and just drives home so many points and rings true with so many things that are happening. And I just wanted to say that I thought the whole idea of kind of moving away from curated spaces and looking at kind of local spaces around the globe, wherever they might be, I think it's really important because I personally work in a very privileged area of England. You know, the problems that we have here are generally not as bad as some other places around the globe. Yeah, I still think that this idea of the way design education is put forward is still very, very international, and certain really high benchmarks from a particular group of makers, and even in privileged parts of England, I think it's really important to get back to kind of what is the local context, what do we need to design, what does the community there want. And I just it's more of a comment really than a question, but I thought that's a really important point, and I'm really glad that that's been been raised today. So
thank you.
No, I think I would concur with that one. I think one of the most striking quotes that I've captured so far was from yourself, Keneilwe, just on that subject, Sancha. Are we preparing our students to go back into the communities they came from? And in some ways, we're explicitly not. We're preparing them to go into communities that are professional or in other ways reified. And in some senses, our students are taking certain courses in order to get out of situations they might be in. So that to me is a really interesting question, not just for the obvious answers, but maybe for some of the other rich ideas that it involves. I don't know, did anybody else want to come in on that? Or any other questions for Keneilwe?
Not really a question. I guess I'm kind of gently pushing back on something that Sanchez said, and you know, not in the way that I want to push back is you know, sometimes we think, and it's not specifically about what you said, Sanchez. It's a comment, a thought that it kind of sparks in my mind. You know, so sometimes we think in that kind of term of, okay, well, this context, our problems are so different, or our problems are, you know, we kind of rank quality of life sometimes unintentionally. And I think it's good for us to learn in the process that our problems are different, and then, you know, what's the way that we're going to make people, the students, stop and spend some time understanding the context, like Keneilwe is saying, but not necessarily thinking, well, okay, because this is the experience that I have sometimes in the classes that I'm teaching, where the students assume that their quality of life is better than another group's quality of life, you know, and very often we just have to think, okay, how are we changing that frame of thinking? You know, that's one of my big issues in this kind of social innovation space, you know, that you have people who are designing for others, but assuming that their quality of life is better than the people that they're designing with or for. And, you know, I spent a lot of time, and, you know, and Keneilwe, I'd love to chat with you much more about this. You know, how do we intentionally have people understand that it's not that the other group's quality of life is necessarily worse, but it's that the problems are different.
Yeah.
And then we just learn how to do that.
Yeah.
I wonder, just to add to that, is there a clue in one of the other things that you mentioned, Keneilwe, that notion of not just observing, but engaging, that if you're just observing, you are bringing that mindset that you've just described almost, Leslie, and you're either reinforcing it or you're looking for evidence to support it. But the notion of engaging is actually inviting yourself to be changed by that context.
Exactly.
I mean, have you got any examples, or is there anything that you would want to add to that, Keneilwe, or?
So in terms of this notion of engaging versus observing, I've been working on I'm working on a lot of different projects, and I've been working with one of the big NGOs, international NGOs, and their challenge was they wanted to improve malnutrition in one of the African countries. And as we were following the process, of course, right at the beginning, everybody was adamant that they know what the issue is, they know what the problem is. And so they want to focus their energies on innovating and coming up with solutions to the problem that they know. And so I realized that this was going to be, we were going to end up exactly where we are, with solutions that are irrelevant to the context, that don't, because I mean, it's also what I find interesting as well is that it seems as if no one is reflecting on the years that we spend and money that we spend on saying we're developing solutions to issues like malaria, for example. Providing, you know, what are nets, mosquito nets to communities. That's another example of where, you know, people sort of identify something and think that the solution that they have is actually going to work. But in reality, the reason why we still have people dying from malaria is because people's focus is more on other issues. And by understanding what those issues are, in Malawi, for example, they realized that people were not using the mosquito nets for protecting themselves. They were using them for fishing because they need food. So understanding people's needs is quite important. And this happens a lot where a lot of solutions are based on assumptions. We develop solutions based on assumptions. And because we see ourselves as better off than the people that we're designing for, we don't actually take the time to go and listen to their perspective and understand the issues from their perspective. And so with the project that I was doing with one of the international NGOs, once I realized that this was a big problem where we were going to end up exactly where we were, was to suggest that everything that we do around the project, we do it in the community. And of course, a lot of them, a lot of the participants decided that they didn't want to continue with the project because they are going to be spending a lot of time in these rural communities, and they have to acknowledge the fact that the communities are experts in their own lives. And that can be difficult for a lot of us. And I think that's something that we need to change.
Cool. Okay. Does anyone else want to come in, either make a point or ask any questions or any observations? Chris, yeah, did you want to go for it? Oh, I think the problem with your audio there.
I think there's a question.
How about now?
That's it, perfect. Yep.
Hi, so Chris Parker, lecturer of UX Design, Loughborough University. Fantastic talk, great to hear. I just want to echo what I think has been said a few times about design students having this idea that their life or that life over there is so much better than one over there. And I think if you'd shown them at your childhood village, they would be horrified. Like, how could you live there? How could you be happy? And like the way you described it was so wonderful. And I'm not really sure how to get my students to fully appreciate happiness and diversity. If you've got any suggestions, in addition to what you said, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one, because I often talk about design education for me having felt like this very extractive thing where I'm uprooted from my reality and my context into this new reality. But at the same time, there's this contradiction, because there's an expectation that I should be able to go back to my community and make a difference. And so I think one way to do it is to make sure that as much as we are educating them in these spaces, but we often bring or often make sure that the learning doesn't only happen in the curated spaces. So finding a balance between them learning the tools and techniques in the environment, because obviously as one person who's teaching, you can't be in multiple locations at the same time. But making sure that the way you design the training that you're doing, it forces them to get out of their comfort zone, basically, forces them to get out of these curated spaces. But also trying things like, setting up projects where they actually have to work with communities from beginning to end, not just going out to interview people and then going back to our perfect space, but making sure that the project is set up in situ and that they get to engage with the other stakeholders as well. And also they get to learn and start realizing that they are not communities, like I said, the stakeholders are also experts in their own lives. And so you as a design student, yes, you might be bringing in other tools and techniques, but you should also be open to learning from the community themselves. Okay. So it's about making sure that we helping students realize that it's a continuous learning journey. It never stops.
Cool. Thank you, Keneilwe. There's a question I'd like to pick up in the text. It's from Leave. Leave, I don't know if you want to talk to the question, but it's asking about working with children, designing with children, and what are the main challenges in such collaboration. Is that?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about, especially this symmetry or asymmetry between designers, grown-ups, and children. They have different perspectives and different kinds of knowledge. And what's the challenge as you see it?
I think the biggest challenge is if you go in too structured, that becomes a problem, because if you're working with kids, they are so full of energy and so full of ideas. And basically all that, at least my reflections from working with them is that all you need to do is to sort of have a high level idea of what is gonna be happening and how it's gonna be happening. So for example, putting them in teams, making sure that you are aware of the different personalities and so forth. Because one of the interesting things that I learned as well is that it seems to be very easy for kids to collaborate than with grown-ups. Kids, if they are given clear guidelines right from the beginning, and they know that we are here because we want to reimagine what a science center might look like in your community. They are very much open to engage and participate. The biggest challenge though is concentration. So you need to make sure and be aware that you time the activities and you have multiple breaks in between, because the concentration level is limited. But in terms of creativity and ability to collaborate, I think that we can learn a lot as grown-ups from kids.
Just a little follow-up. Do the kids have any design education in the general education?
No, they don't.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
But they do drawing and such things?
That I worked with, none of them had any design experience or design. Don't even, it's not even a concept in their school. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just thinking there, Leave. I wonder whether we should. It'd be interesting to see how many countries around the world, whether in early years education, as you say, Keneilwe, that's a lovely phrase, whether design is even a concept, or how it's framed in these spaces. Sorry, I'm just going to come to another question in the chat. So it's from Sharon. Sharon, I don't know if you want to sort of ask this question yourself, but this is around about failure as a mode of working, I suppose, or as a concept in design process. I'm guessing the language issue, maybe asking whether there's another fantastic proverb that talks about failure or learning from failure.
I'd love to hear it. Yeah, I think I'm partly responding to the tsunami of positivity around design thinking and how that's sort of permeating the globe at the moment. It's another pandemic, I think. But absolutely key to this is the permission to fail, I think, and designed into the thinking and the process and the mindset. Yeah. And we don't talk about it. I don't see it talked about in the literature and in case studies and so on. But for me, failure is, failing your way to success kind of metaphor. And I just wondered if you'd encountered that kind of conversation and how it had played out in any of your projects, if you had an example, because I think it's a fascinating.
Yeah, very good question. I mean, failure is seen as this scary thing. That's how we are educated, to fear failure, which is not helpful in terms of the complexity that we have to deal with, and uncertainty and ambiguity that we have to deal with. And some of the projects that I've worked on have failed as well. That is the reality, because a lot of the times, sometimes there is misalignment between misalignment between what people expect or what people think should be done. And of course, there is always the issue of power dynamics as well. In a lot of projects that I work in, you'll find that you have a key decision maker deciding that we should be going forward with this project, but the way it's communicated to the people that are actually participating in the project is completely different. And so it's always, I mean, as a designer, you find yourself having to navigate, between achieving what the key decision maker is expecting, but also dealing with reality on the ground in terms of the everyday project. And I think it's also about managing expectations. So learning to help manage expectations. And one of the proverbs that I really like around the notion of failure is to get lost is to learn the way. Understanding that, things are not always gonna go the way we think they should, but it's an opportunity for us to learn.
Brilliant.
So, yeah.
That was the one.
I hope that answers your question.
I was going to say that's the proverb, and
that's the one. Yeah.
I come from Northern Ireland, so to get lost means a lot in Northern Ireland. So again, context is all.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful to hear your projects. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
So I'm going to go to one last one, and it's maybe fitting that this is the kind of last one. It's more a comment from Donna, but maybe there is a question, an implicit question in here. It's round about the, if you like, the final stage that we all kind of sometimes often ignore as designers, that notion of the implementation stage and actually sticking around to see what happens to the project, what really happens, and actually confronting what it is you've actually, or what's actually happening. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that. Have any of your projects moved into the implementation phase, or have really sort of gone into those sorts of stages, Keneilwe?
Yeah, so some of them have moved into the implementation stage with a lot of resistance in some cases, because like I said, a lot of the times there's this misconception that innovation is something that is done, in fancy spaces by a small select few, and then they produce this magic that is then presented to the rest of the organization. And as a result of that, you find that some ideas, as much as you've invested a lot of time and energy to come up to develop them. For example, one of the financial institutions that I worked with in Cape Town, they developed a service for soon to be retired employees, so that they can transition easier from work life to retirement. And the service, what was interesting about it is that as we're doing our research, we realized that there's quite a lot of local knowledge and practices that are often not taken into consideration when financial services are developed. For example, you have this practice of they're called stokvels in South Africa, where people sort of co-invest or save towards achieving a certain goal together. And it happens a lot in the informal context, but none of the financial institutions have ever thought of developing that service or formalizing that particular service so that people can continue these habits that they have. So it's like a lot of the times projects fail because I think they sort of, it's that gap between context and practice. So the lack of understanding of the context, even though you might have developed a project to a certain point, because you don't, often people see the project outcome as the tangible thing, as opposed to taking into consideration how do people behave, and how is this project, or how is this service or product that we've developed, how are people engaging with it going forward? And so because there's a lot of hard work that needs to continue happening, people just give up.
Okay, cool. Again, I wonder if that goes back to the kind of observation versus engagement thing, that notion of just almost like the lack of engagement that's sometimes implicit, particularly in the ways that we approach most observation that happens for design. Because
also engagement is a continuous thing. It's not something that you only do now and then you stop. It should be continuous.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm wondering whether we even explore properly those contexts of engagement, because it's not necessarily just communities, it can be spaces.
And that's important.
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's an hour. I know we could go on for absolutely ages, and but all I can do, Keneilwe, once again, is thank you very much for that. It's really interesting to hear a hyper-contextualized approach as well. And it highlights, well, for me personally, the critical importance of, not just observing, but engaging with voices and what people are actually doing in design education around the world, and that it is and can be very different to some of the normative, I suppose, assumptions that we do make about our own practices in design education. Sorry, that was sounding really preachy. I'm really sorry. I'm not going to preach it more. Keneilwe, thank you so much for that.
Thank you, everybody. It's been great spending the afternoon with you, and all the best.
Absolutely, and thank you very much. The next discussion or event that we're going to have will be on the 19th of February. Once again, my apologies that we couldn't do the early years education thing today. We'll be doing that on the 19th of February with Liv Marette Nielsen and Ingvild de Granis. Sorry, who's that? Nope, it's okay. So my apologies. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.